Hi, my name is Ken Sobel, and welcome to the CNN virtual conference with our topic today being political activism for our cannabis professionals. And I include that term broadly, our nurses, our doctors, our other healthcare providers, and our other interested listeners who want a little bit more information and knowledge about political activism. And we start out ahead because we have nurses who are the most trusted professionals and have been so for the last 10 or 20 years, at least in terms of Gallup polling. And there's nothing more powerful and more effective when we're engaged in political activism than having a truth teller involved as one of those activists. And I'm sure you've already had experiences in your life of being involved in political activism. And so I'm probably not telling you some of the things that you already experienced, but hopefully I can put this in the context of cannabis, talk about some of the cannabis issues that we fought for, and also maybe give you a process that you can follow as you tackle the next important issue, either in your community or in your state or in our country when it comes to cannabis activism. Again, my name is Ken Sobel. I'll give you a little bit more detail about my background and why I'm instructing in this course. But let me begin first by talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the fight for our veterans. Imagine the Army veteran who returns from Iraq, suffering the trauma that he received on the battlefield and his exposure to interim explosive device or IEDs. Upon his return back home, he experiences flashbacks, recurring nightmares, sleeplessness, anger, hypertension, distress, and recurring ideations of suicide. Angry confrontations with his wife, family members, friends, and coworkers ensue. The VA may prescribe some SSRIs, antidepressants like Paxil or Zoloft, and basically prescription drugs that were never really intended for PTSD, but are prescribed off-label. And these medications have the profound effect of increasing the ideations of suicide and causing sexual dysfunction and a lot of other side effects that are really harmful to this veteran who's now back in the US and trying to reacclimate himself, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I might also add that, prior to 2011, the circumstances were such that the VA would refuse to treat veterans who self-described themselves as using cannabis for anything. So through political activism on that front, we eventually were able to get the VA to change their policy so that they at least would provide the care and treatment that our veterans have earned, whether or not they self-disclose using cannabis. But these folks come back and they understand just through their interactions with their peers and their colleagues that cannabis is probably the best thing that they can use to help them for post-traumatic stress disorder. In 2010, the voters in Arizona passed the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act, or AMA. It passed by 0.1% of the entire statewide vote. The elected leaders in that state, of course, were totally opposed to anything that had to do with cannabis for the most part. And this particular statute, AMA, that was voted on by the voters, didn't provide for the qualifying condition for post-traumatic stress disorder. It involved a list of about 7 or 8 different conditions, but none of those included post-traumatic stress disorder. Thus, our war heroes were left in Arizona without the protection the law affords to a qualified cannabis user. And instead, after fighting bravely on the battlefield for our country, they were nonetheless now facing back alley drug deals to get the marijuana or the cannabis that they needed, and possibly face criminal sanctions if they were caught. So begins the story of our fight to add post-traumatic stress disorder to the list of qualifying conditions. Another situation occurs with Ryan's story, we'll call it, the fight for terminally ill patients. Ryan Bartell was just 42 years old when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He immediately sought conventional treatments of radiation and chemotherapy, but the cancer had spread throughout his body. At the hospital, he was given strong opioids, morphine and fentanyl, for his pain management, which mainly put him to sleep and unaware of his surroundings. Finally, Nurse Heather was brought in, and she recommended certain extracts for medical cannabis, and including concentrates and edibles. And we were able to provide that to Ryan, and he was able to completely get comfortable in terms of his pain conditions, and it allowed him to function more normally, even though the disease would be ultimately fatal. However, the hospital that he was in refused to allow him to use cannabis. And though the family was then tasked with going all over the city that he was in and trying to find a hospital that would let him be there and receive the treatments that he needed, but at the same time to use the medical cannabis that Nurse Heather had recommended. When Ryan was able to use cannabis, of course, it was much better than the fentanyl that it replaced, the opioids that it replaced, because it actually allowed him to deal with the painful conditions, but at the same time, be able to be lucid and conscious and available to his family, because the condition that he had would likely last only a few more weeks. And so it was that he eventually passed a few weeks later, but at least he had a quality of life during that last period of time. After Ryan's passing, his dad, who was a friend of mine, decided to do something to help terminally ill patients in deep suffering who are receiving care in California healthcare facilities, but are also denied access to medical cannabis. So his father and I worked together with our local San Diego legislative leaders, and we crafted a bill, Senate Bill 305. And Senate Bill 305 would have specifically provided that hospitals are required to have, and other healthcare facilities are required to have, a policy that allows hospice patients who have 12 months or less to live, to be able to use their own cannabis in the hospital. Obviously, it had restrictions on vaping it, restrictions on smoking it, but as far as using it as a concentrate or a topical or an edible, it would be allowed. This is the story of the fight to require hospitals to allow terminally ill patients to use cannabis in the hospital. So before finishing these stories and adding a couple of others on political activism to let you know how we eventually worked on those issues, let me tell you a little bit about my background and why it is that I'm giving this lecture today. Again, I'm Ken Sobel. I'm an AV-rated lawyer. 40 years ago, I took and passed the bar exam for California and Arizona in the same week, and passed both on my first try. It was kind of an unusual thing. As far as I know, it's the first and only time it ever happened. But by December of 1980, I was a fully admitted and licensed member of the California and Arizona bars. I had a fairly conventional law practice up until about 2001, when I discovered the important medical benefits of cannabis. It changed my life, and it made me a lifelong passionate advocate for it. But even before then, when I was in high school years, I was involved in the first Earth Day that we had. We were involved as a mayor's youth council in putting on concerts at the local convention center. I later went on to the University of Arizona, where I was served as the student body president, started and founded a student carnival that raised funds for a lot of the charitable organizations that we wanted to support but didn't have the funds to do so. And that program, called Spring Fling, 45 years later, is the largest student-run carnival in the United States and earns millions of dollars for lots of charities. After college, I was involved heavily as a speechwriter and a lobbyist for the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, better known as AFL-CIO. And I worked in Washington, D.C., and I presented issues for safe workplaces for our members, as well as proper and prevailing wage standards for our members. Subsequently, I served as a national officer for my college fraternity, where I reformed their pledge education program so that it was a safe and sensible pledge education program that was limited in time and duration and had no hazing involved in it. And I also worked as an intermediary between the undergraduate members and the graduate members in developing appropriate alcohol policies that were safe and sensible also. Later on, I got involved as an activist with my kids' schools, and I raised over $1 million to build safe fields and facilities where kids could play. And I worked with County Board of Supervisor, the local school district, and all of the other constituent members to make sure our kids have safe places to play. I've also been involved with education reform. I served as president of the Grossmont College Foundation, which is a 2-year community college in San Diego. And I also served as chairman of their bond oversight committee, which was a $300 million bond project to rebuild those campuses. So throughout my life, I've had experiences in political activism and even ran for office before. But in cannabis advocacy, I turned my attention to the rights of patients and others to safely and successfully use cannabis, and to encourage local jurisdictions to have proper and safe regulations for cannabis businesses, cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, and retail. In Arizona, I created 3 statewide organizations for patient advocacy and commerce. We were the only ones to add, as I will describe in a minute, a new qualifying condition. And we obtained multiple medical and adult cannabis licenses for ourselves and for others. I also was responsible for drafting the Medical Cannabis Patient Care Act for the U.S. Virgin Islands. So my time involved in the industry and in other experiences have led me to the point where I share with you my thoughts about political activism. So back to the fight for our veterans and our terminally ill patients and their right to use cannabis in a hospital setting. In the case of our post-traumatic stress disorder veterans, we prepared a 109-page petition on behalf of the Arizona Cannabis Nurses Association, which of course was founded by Nurse Heather. And we demanded that the Arizona Department of Health Services add PTSD as a qualifying condition under the state of Arizona Administrative Code process. When the Arizona Department of Health refused to add that condition, we then provided I provided legal representation for the AZCNA to force the department's hand by taking them to what is known as an administrative law judge. In that case, we had it's kind of like the Scopes monkey trial for some of those who remember in history in Tennessee. Clarence Darrow and was involved in proving evolution. And that was the first time in the history of the United States that we put on a 4.5-day evidentiary trial to prove that cannabis was safe and effective for utilization for PTSD. We did a 4.5-day evidentiary hearing, had multiple medical, healthcare, powerful testimony by Nurse Heather and by our veteran community, and another expert in the field of pharmaceuticals, because we not only had to prove the efficacy of cannabis, but we had to disprove other alternatives like the Paxil, as I described before. At the end of the hearing, the judge agreed with us, and he ruled, quote, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that cannabis provides safe and effective relief for symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and PTSD was then added to the Arizona list of qualifying conditions. To this day, over the 10-year history of the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act and the 10-year history of their cannabis program, this is the first and only time that a new condition was added. So it was a complete success. In the case of our cancer patient, Ryan, we worked with Ryan's dad, as mentioned before, to create California Senate Bill 305. In California, you have a bicameral legislative system, and I'll talk about this in a minute about the structure of government and how you effectively advocate and what forum you need to go to. But in this case, we worked with the California Senate with a local legislative representative here. He agreed to introduce the bill and drew in some co-sponsors. That was then brought into the California Senate. The Senate then undertakes to have hearings, just like they do in all other issues for the most part. And so Senate Bill 305 worked its way through the Senate. And eventually we got a 40-0 unanimous vote to pass Senate Bill 305, 40-0, every Republican, every Democrat, every independent. We also then worked with the California Assembly, and it was scheduled for an Assembly Health Committee hearing. And just before we went into the hearing, we were told that the chairman was inclined to vote against it because he had been worked on by the hospital lobby, which didn't want to jeopardize their Medicare, Medi-Cal, and other federal reimbursements. And so at the 11th hour, I had to craft an exception that would allow them to suspend the right to have cannabis in a healthcare facility if the federal government attempted to cut off their funding. So we worked in new language. A bill was amended. It passed unanimously in the Assembly Health Committee. The Assembly as a whole voted 77-0 in favor of Senate Bill 305. And so every Democrat, every Republican, every independent, we had 2 unanimous votes from 2 separate legislative bodies. And then it went to the governor's desk. Now, Gavin Newsom, who's the governor, was considered to be a friend and ally for cannabis. He had been part of working with the industry to develop the state medical and adult cannabis programs, and we were confident he would sign it. Even so, we still attempted to lobby and talk to his representatives beforehand, but sadly, he, on the last day that he could sign or veto a bill, he vetoed it. And the hospital industry had gotten to him, and he took their word for it that they could lose some of their federal reimbursements, even though that was entirely false. And instead, he vetoed the bill. We have now brought the bill back, although currently it's on hold because of COVID, and likely will not get any action until 2021. So these are the couple of scenarios that I've described. And so in your own approaching an issue that you're interested in, let me kind of give you some ideas on how to analyze it and how to get the support for it, how to move through the process. And I've basically reduced it to the acronym FIGHT, F-I-T-E, and that's F as in forum, I as in issue, T as in team, and E as in enact. And you have to fight with passion. So let me explain how that works. First of all, forum, you can choose an issue that may be local, state, or federal. Sometimes all 3, but usually it falls into one of those 3 categories. And depending upon what the issue is, will determine where you want to go to make the change. So you have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, and that's true whether it's local, state, or federal. So if the issue is local and you're dealing with the executive branch, you're dealing with a city councilor, city manager, a strike that you should be dealing with a city mayor or a city manager. And those executive branch usually involves rules, policies, and actions. On the legislative side, you have also cities that have ordinances, and those are passed by the city council. On the state level, it usually involves an assembly or a senate or similar, like a House of Representatives. It'll be called something different in different states, but that'll be handling the legislative side. And of course, on the federal level, you have the Congress, and that's the Senate, US Senate, and the House of Representatives. And it's the legislative branch that enacts statutes that the executive branch then executes. And then lastly, you have the judicial branch. And so some issues fall within that. And so particularly when you're dealing with an issue where you have a contested or disputed issue, like for example, if the city attempts to shut down a cannabis dispensary, you would have the right to go to court and file for declaratory relief, and you could sue that action, whether it was executive or legislative, and take them to court. And that typically, of course, involves hiring lawyers because it's difficult at best for non-lawyers to survive the whole judicial process. And an example of that might be the current issue that we're involved in with the case seeking to deschedule or reschedule cannabis. First time that ever happened was back in 1972, and it took 20 years, and it still didn't result in getting that descheduling done. But suffice it to say that that involves a court action, suing the DEA, for example, for declaratory relief and requesting that the court order the DEA to deschedule or reschedule cannabis. So that's what you have. The form is either local, state, or federal, and it's either executive, legislative, or judicial. Issue, I for issue, is maybe access, safe access. It may be decriminalization. It may be health issues or licensing or regulation. There's a whole host of things that you can think of. A lot of the movement now is focused on making sure that kids have safe access to cannabis for a lot of the conditions that they suffer from and for which cannabis is so beneficial. But these are the types of issues that you might confront. Whatever your own issue happens to be, once you identify it, you have to understand what is the best forum for you to pursue it in. And then T is in team, is developing strength in numbers and surrounding yourself with other folks who may have a similar issue that they're interested in and are also engaged or want to be engaged in helping to move the issue forward. And so the teams that you can rely on, especially for legislative issues, I must say, because the politicians fear voters. And so if you can make compelling cases to city council and you have a number of people who are involved in it, then those tend to be sometimes the most responsive. But others who might share your view and want to join with you as a part of the team would be trade organizations like the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce or the National Cannabis Industry Association. You also have advocacy organizations like the Americans for Safe Access, and there's many, many local ASA chapters. The same with Drug Policy Alliance or NORML. Students for Sensible Drug Policy, ACLU. There's a whole host of them. And so you'll need to network in your local community to find out which of those organizations are there, or if they're not there, maybe you start that organization with your issue in mind. And then lastly is enact. You know, once you've identified the issue that you want to pursue, what forum that it needs to be brought in, and the team that you'll have surrounding you, the goal is to get it enacted. So if it's an executive branch decision, you want them to take some executive action, an executive order, or something similar to that, or to change a policy that may be detrimental. If it's a city council or a state legislature, you're going to want them to pass an ordinance, or you're going to want them to pass a statute. And if it's a judicial one, then you'll want to try to find the lawyers who might be inclined to help support you to work pro bono. So for example, when the Arizona Cannabis Nurses Association wanted to pursue adding PTSD as a qualifying condition, I did that entirely pro bono. And about $500,000 worth of legal time and expense later, we ended up succeeding. But they are, time consuming and expensive usually. So that kind of gives, you have to fight, and you have to fight with passion. And as nurses, because you're empathetic, you will be the perfect person to pursue some of these issues and to make a difference in your communities. So let me give you some other examples and what we fought on, some other political activism. After Arizona narrowly passed the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act, like I said, it was less than 0.1%. The legislature immediately moved to try to negate, mitigate, or even rescind what the voters had just done. And so I organized an ad hoc business owners group of 5 of us who already had announced our intention to open dispensaries in Arizona. And we put together a war chest, hired lobbyists, and worked with the legislatures to convince them that it was a fool's errand to try to repeal what the voters had just done. And at the end of the day, we were able to successfully prevent them from doing so. And so let me give you a couple of other hypotheticals of some of the work that we've been involved in, especially because these directly relate to the Cannabis Nurse Network and Nurse Heather. We met Senator Terrence A. Positive Nelson. He was a 6-term territorial senator for the U.S. Virgin Islands when we met him several years ago. He's believed to be the first Rastafarian elected public official in the U.S., and he was kind enough to give me this beautiful emblem of the Rastafarian community in the U.S. Virgin Islands after we had met. We met Senator Positive in Denver, Colorado. He just completed a fact-finding mission. He was interested in setting up a cannabis program for the USVI, and subsequently invited Nurse Heather and me to visit him there. We did a week-long educational tour of St. Croix and St. Thomas, met with hundreds of people from their communities, healthcare workers, students, business members. I did a session with the legal community at one of their bar association meetings. And afterwards, we returned back to San Diego, and then I drafted the Medical Cannabis Patient Care Act and provided that to Senator Positive. Subsequently got introduced in the Senate. USVI is a little different than most states. It has only one legislative body. It's called a unicameral body, and that was the USVI Senate, and it consisted of 15 members. Any of our legislation would have to have at least 9 votes so it could overcome a veto that we expected the governor would have. We then participated in the hearings that were held on the U.S. Virgin Islands in front of their health committee. We testified in favor, of course, in favor of the MCPCA. The other side brought in, I think it was about 6 doctors from their medical community there, each of whom said they opposed cannabis. But when I asked Senator Positive, I said, be sure to ask them if they know what the human endocannabinoid system is. And so he asked each of them in seriatim, which, do you know what the human endocannabinoid system? They all said no. In any event, after that health committee, we couldn't get it out of committee at that time. But about 2 years later, finally, the entire USVI Senate voted on it, and it passed. The governor signed it into law on January 2019. So it took several years, but sometimes something worth having is worth waiting for. And through our persistence and the dedication of Senator Nelson, USVI now has their own Medical Cannabis Patient Care Act. And then, as I mentioned before, another scenario that involved the judicial side of it is the fight to deschedule marijuana. And as mentioned, numerous attempts have been made because of the obstacles that have been placed that prevent compelling the DEA to act in a timely way. None of these efforts have yet succeeded. And so we're involved currently in a project where a group has asked us to join an existing lawsuit by an outside organization and ask the court and tell the court that you join in their request and give reasons why. And so that, again, is a judicial type of action that requires lawyers to be involved in. So these are some examples of how we work through the process. As I said, our cannabis nurses have always been our valued and trusted professionals who are very convincing when they get behind. As I always say, the fight has to start somewhere. And if it's not me, then who? And if it's not now, then when? So I applaud you for taking the time to participate as part of this virtual conference, and hope that you're successful in what you do as far as your activism in the community. Again, it's been a pleasure being with you today. I'm Ken Sobel. If you have any questions, there'll be information following the conference on how you can contact me. Thanks so much, and have a great time.
My name's Dion Markgraf. I'm going to make a little presentation about maybe some other aspects of cannabis hemp that you may or may not know, and what I've been doing to promote the different issues. As you'll see, my history and stuff, but the basic premise of this discussion is that hemp is hope. You know, if I was a kid these days, I'd be totally depressed in the state of the way things are. And I am saying in this analogy, are a virus, like an eco-virus that is, you know, taking over the world in a bad way, and something we need to address. And hemp is the vaccine to that virus. And, you know, I'm going to go through a few things, but there's one main way I think that we can make a big difference, because we already have many problems, but we're headed to more problems. So we better start addressing it. And I'm happy to speak to you guys here, because you are on the front lines of interacting with people, and especially with cannabis. The more you know, you're on the front lines of telling people what the situation is. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. So as we know, hemp is, you know, many things. It's a great medicine. It's safe and effective. It's a great source of food. It's the #1 source of protein, essential fatty acids. But even the clothing has medical benefits, in that it's antibacterial, antifungal. So in hospitals, and you know, we need to be using this. And of course, it's less environmentally damaging. This crop is basically our best hope for the future. But one of the biggest part of our whole industry is really going to be its other uses in construction. And those uses will have a big impact, a crucial impact on our health and our future. So this is a crop in Holland, one of the first ones, and they used the flowers for CBD and the rest of the plant for all the uses I'm about to go over. So my whole thing at the moment is I'm trying to figure out how many hemp homes would we need to build to balance our existence as a species on the planet. So that's a huge problem. And I hope that I'm presenting a solution that is from this same plant. So of course, you know, we all know, or should know, that we have a huge environmental problem. And I don't want to really get into the debate of how bad it is, but it's bad. We're in a critical situation, and literally millions of people are dying every year from it. All our friends and family, from the pollution. It's in the millions, but I don't want to get bogged down on the numbers. So who am I? I've been in the cannabis hemp industry for 30 years. I opened the first hemp store in Europe in 1993. I helped start medical marijuana in Holland, magazine. And I've also believed from the beginning that this is like an education campaign. So I started a university that I do lectures till this day. When I lived in Amsterdam, I started the Cannabis College, which is still there and open every day. When medical marijuana passed here in California, in San Diego, I came back from Holland and tried to help, and I opened the first dispensary in San Diego. And I've been involved in the trenches, been arrested many times. And then over time, I got into CBD, as many people did. And I knew about CBD for maybe 20 years. I didn't know it would be that powerful and so useful, but I helped start the CBD industry with a company called General Hemp, who funded many of the first companies around the world. And one of the big things they did is I helped get CBD in cannabinoids into Mexico and help change their laws. And of course, through, small children who benefited in the truth of this great plant. So yes, I've been buying and selling cannabis all over the world for, I guess coming on 3 decades now. And I believe it's the, revolution, and it's very important. But again, back to really the science and the education part of it, I've always had 2 big lessons I just want to throw out there real quick. One is that the trichomes, the flowers of the plant, will basically pay for all the rest of the plant, the process. So, all these other things could be either, not free, but very costless. So our consumption together is a main way to promote the industry. And then again, it's all less expensive. So this has been on my agenda for almost 30 years. So now we're be able to live that dream now here in America for the first time, is that we can get the cannabinoids out of the flowers, and then the rest of the plant is essentially free or costless, or, we could outcompete the competition for sure. And as we'll see, with superior products. So now here in San Diego Vista, I am busy with construction, because after examining all the different aspects, I believe that the construction is really what's needed at the moment. So here in San Diego, I've built 2 cool hemp structures and been doing classes. On the bottom is the world's first tiny hemp house on wheels. And on the top is a project that I'm busy with at the moment, and trying to make a hemp church that people can come and worship and learn. And I believe it's very important. And so again, I've been doing classes. I created that the tiny hemp house for Earth Day here in San Diego, and the following year I tried to burn it down. So yeah, so hemp is fireproof. So I've been, racking my brain of how to demonstrate all these abilities, and that's what I'm busy with now. So the main thing I'm doing these days is I've started a group called the USHBA, the US Hemp Building Association, and I'm trying to advance this across the country, because, as I say, really the big picture of our the way we're impacting our environment is killing us, is totally inefficient, and can be solved with hemp. So I'm busy with this national organization, and you can check out our website for further updates. But when it comes to housing, if you look at what we currently are using, there are chemicals and very bad toxic off-gassing materials that that contribute to asthma, cancer, autism, obesity. So a lot of the main problems. So not only are we talking about, this big other picture, but directly we're being poisoned with the things that we're using today. So hempcrete and hemp can offset this whole thing. And the biggest thing is it's carbon sequestering. It's, it has so many great properties. It's resistant, mold resistant, so many problems today come from just the homes that we're in. But the big thing that I wanted to get across to everyone is that you may not know is actually construction is perhaps the biggest problem on the planet, the way we're doing it today. So the number one source of CO2 by industry is the construction industry. So basically close to 40%, as you can see here, comes from construction. And if you put all the transportation of trains, automobiles, and everything, you can see it's only like 22%. You know, we could debate the statistics exactly, but the point is construction is by far the biggest problem, the way we're going at the moment. Terrible. But conversely, it's only going to looks worse for the future. That's because we need to virtually double the amount of houses we need for our population. You know, we're about to add, you know, billions of people onto the planet. And if you could see the statistic from the UN, by 2060, you know, we're supposed to add 2.5 trillion square feet of building, which is like adding a New York City size construction impact every 34 days for the next 40 years. So this is a huge problem. There just literally isn't a bigger problem in the big scope of things. You know, we might see the things we see today. It's like we're in the beginning days of that pandemic that we're living through now, that, you know, if we don't act and be smart, you know, we're gonna suffer way more than we need to. The great news is that we have a wonderful plant that we all love that is so useful in so many ways that can turn this equation on its head. So it can turn the biggest problem in the world into the biggest solution. Why? Because hemp is the great construction material that is carbon negative. So after you calculate all the energy that goes into the house, all the transportation, all the materials, just because you use hemp, it will be carbon negative. So it will actually clean the sky with hemp in this big picture virus killing way. So again, hemp, you know, stores the CO2 because it breathes it in, and it breathes more CO2 in than almost any crop. So 22 tons per hectare is taken in every year from every hectare, 2.5 acres. So as you can see here in the cattle field, that's where you get the CBD and the food and the nutritious part, but the rest of the plant can be made into almost everything. And again, its impact is a good impact. And so the point is then we need to put all this plant material and energy into something. And what to put it in? Our walls of our houses, because it makes a superior product. And it's super simple. That's broken down. The hemp hurd, which is the inner part of the plant, and you mix it together with water, and very quickly it will turn hard. Over time, it will get harder. And a great thing about this as well is it's local. So this can be done everywhere in the world, and it's locally based economy and less of energy. You don't need to ship this all around. So a great thing. So again, you can put it in your walls in many ways, either through bricks, you could spray it in, you could cast it in, you could precast it in, and it's all possible. And again, this would be a way to take all that CO2 and put it into something that would sequester it. So how much would we really need to do? We need to make, you know, millions of homes. Basically, we need to make all our homes in the future this way to turn this whole scenario around. Because if we don't, as the statistic says here, we're basically, you know, we're cooking ourselves to death, and of course all other species, or most other species. And then the good news is that we have, again, the same statistic that, you know, we could store lots of CO2 in this manner. You know, basically an endless amount of opportunity to put it into these homes that we need. Here in California today, we have a housing crisis. It's like our biggest problems after the current virus, of course. But here in California, just alone, we need 3.5 million homes just to come up to where we need today. So think about that environmental impact. So this is nothing new as far as the technology. We've been building with lime and other things for years. The Roman aqueducts, many things throughout time were used with lime, rocks, and plant material. So here's some examples here. There's an example here in India from 1500 years ago. It was a World Heritage Site today, and none of these hemp, lime, clay technology has degraded. Here's a house in Japan that's 500 years old. So again, we're talking about a superior product. And again, you know, hemp can be used with all these other things. It's not just hemp, but hemp makes almost everything exponentially better. And on the bottom corner is an example of that, where there's a bridge in France that only has 10% hemp in it, and it was made in the year around 500 AD. And everything from that surrounding village what has been degraded over time through natural weathering that wasn't hemp. But this bridge that had 10% hemp in it has survived, and it's had a river going through it. So that's a great testament. I love to tell that story. And then in Europe, they're way more advanced than us. There's many places on the planet that are you know, further than we are, sadly. But in Europe, they've embraced it greatly. The technology really sort of comes from France. They're making track homes, as you can see, in England. Their Marks and Spencers is kind of like our Nordstrom's, a very fancy retail company, and you can see they're making their department stores with hemp, and they're saving huge amount of money on just energy. So there's so many reasons to use this, and for these type of people, they're saving 50 to 75% of their energy bill, which in turn is, you know, for a big department store is like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And this is another example of a multi-story kind of pushed it more and more. There's ones in Washington. There's one in North Carolina that you can see on the bottom, was made in 2009. So it shows the industry is not that old. The mayor of Asheville, North Carolina, built that house because his daughter was sensitive to the chemicals in buildings. And then interesting, this one on the bottom corner is a little tiny house, hemp house, made in Texas, right across the street, sort of model homeless place where they show how this, you know, technology can work. And, you know, so, you know, when it comes to the virus and all this stuff is exposing so much in our society, and homelessness is a big health risk to everybody. And it's so inefficient. So for example, every homeless person on average costs between $30,000 and $40,000 per year, every year, to society being on the streets. Whereas, you know, you could build a tiny house for them and help them off the street for $30,000 or $40,000, and it's a permanent thing. And if you make it out of hemp, it could, tick all these other boxes. So of course, hemp is not just hempcrete. Today, there's all kinds of particle boards being made with it. This is one of the most exciting products. It's called hemp wood out of Kentucky. It's a hardwood that is 20% stronger than oak. So imagine that. And 1 acre of hemp equals 15 to 30 oak trees that take, 60 to 200 years to grow. And this could be made and grown in months, and it's a better product. So that's just one of the many examples that we have today. So what can you do? You could become a member of our group, of course. You can tell friends, you could help donate. Again, you're on the front line and you talk with everybody about their health. And I know it's not always applicable, but in a big picture way, hopefully, learning this information today and with these follow-up resources, you can dive deeper into the situation. And as I was saying earlier, one of the big lessons I hope you take away from this is our liberation is through our consumption. We vote every day, and we vote for our future through our consumption. And if you, eat, wear, live in hemp, then that's the quicker that we'll, get to this promised land of ending our eco-virus input that we are having on the earth, and we need this turnaround. And again, we have a lot of information that we're developing in these regards on our website, the USHBA.org. This is a global initiative, and it's not going to be done by one person or one group. And we have already engaged the UN. The UN has voted, because we're in this crisis, that we need to turn the whole world around by 2030. And the UN has already voted that we need to be sustainable by that time period, which is 100% not possible without hemp. And this group that you can look up, FOT.net, they have put this living publication together that they've presented everyone in the UN, and they're actually voting in December to change the course possibly of cannabis policy. So they all have gotten this document that shows that all the goals that are laid out and have already been voted into action in the UN can be made with cannabis hemp. We can make those goals with cannabis hemp, and we need to all, get this process going, because without it, there is no hope. There is no future, unless something comes out of left field, of course. So again, how many homes? I don't know. The point is that we just need to get busy and start consuming it. Our group is trying to do their best. I'm sure you're trying to do your best on the front line, and we empower each other with information, and I hope we can do it. So interesting, I thought I knew about this information. This is a global planetary thing. And here's an example in Nepal where they have taken wild hemp that's growing, naturally all over the country, and they're building hospitals. This is a hospital built in Nepal recently, and just using primitive materials, local materials, and they built this hospital. And again, with this technology, it reverses so many of the problems. It's a healthy material. The walls breathe. There's no bacteria. It lasts longer. So many things. So please check it out. And finally, just to wrap it up, I know we're all on the same boat in, literally we've only got this one planet. So the time is to act now. It's like those early days when, you know, earlier this year when there were so many opportunities to move and do things and think ahead. Well, that opportunity is now on our plate. Hemp is legal. CBD is well known. The you know where there's less excuses today not to get this done. So double down your efforts. This is the time for action, and the clock is ticking. We are literally, we're in those days of those early virus. I mean, it's all relative. So please get organized, do your best. My name and email is there if you want to reach out to me. And again, just to end it up, hemp is hope, and I'm very confident about the revolution. I just am more worried about the timing and as if we can do it. Just as I'm, convinced that we will, overcome the virus that we're dealing with today. I think we need to work together to try to, bring this knowledge of hemp and what it can do to the planet and help heal each other and hold out hope for the future. Hemp is hope. Let's do it together. Viva the revolution. Thank you.